Okay, good evening, everyone. Glad to see everybody this evening. Glad to have Lund back with us. It seems like he left Regina, unless if she just didn't walk in here. We'll find out later. Oh, she's home. Okay. But good to see everyone. Glad you can make it out this evening. I'm kind of more so in Sunday attire. I've been at the Spiritual Sword Lectureship in Cleveland, Tennessee this past week. After we get done tonight, I'm driving back to Cleveland. So it's been wonderful. To say the least, that's been spiritually uplifting. That's just kind of the littlest amount of compliment that I can give to it. I mean, there's so much more to say about that. Spiritual events are really good. There's a reason why they send those kind of flyers out into the Brotherhood, just the type of lessons that are presented there, especially this one. Their theme is one another, and they're focusing on all the verses in the New Testament that deal with how we are to encourage one another, mourn with one another, lift up one another, even build up in many ways. And just the lessons have been incredible. You can find some of the evening lessons. I know they've been putting those on Facebook, either the Spiritual Sword Facebook page or East Ridge Church of Christ. It's one of those two. But been fantastic lessons, and I just only missed 4, so I'll be going back tonight for that. But other than that, we do still need to keep Lucas Case in our prayers. He had a good surgery. Sunday when he passed out, and then it was eventful Sunday. David Fowler took him to the hospital. He had his surgery yesterday, and everything came out well. Lucas said he's not going to get any kind of post-op stuff until next Friday, so we still need to keep Lucas in our prayers and check up on him to make sure everything's okay. Outside of that, there are some other announcements, but I'll make them at the end. Calvin, can you lead us in prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Again, we thank you for all the wonderful blessings that you give us. Dear Heavenly Father, again, we'd like to thank you for allowing us to come out here tonight to learn more and to study with you. We ask that you be with those who are fallen ill at this time, that they may be encouraged and stay health. We also ask that you be with those who are traveling at this time, that they may reach the destination safely and come back to us safely. We also ask that you be with those who are not here this evening, for whatever reason they're not here, that we may be with them and they may return to us another point in time. We also ask that you be with the leaders of this country, that the choices that they make may be beneficial for us as a country. We also ask that as we go throughout tonight, that we are mindful of whatever Brother Ethan has on this lesson, that we may apply it to our lives and be better Christians. Forgive us for our sins. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen. In Mark chapter 3, we see a scene where Jesus is flooded by the crowds. In fact, so much so that the house is full inside where Jesus is preaching. And then a person comes to Jesus and says, hey, your mother and your brothers are outside. I can look at John 7 and it'll tell me that there were several brothers that Jesus had. Fun Bible study question you can find in your own time. How many brothers and sisters, yes, sisters, did Jesus have? I'll let you look into that. But as Jesus was preaching, someone came to him and said, "Your mother and your brothers are outside. They desire to see you." And Jesus would ask a fundamental, really just a vital question that is going to lead us into our main focus through Genesis tonight. He would ask the question, who is my mother and my brothers? Now, we'll come back to this story at the end of tonight's lesson. But what we're looking at tonight in the book of Genesis is the ending of chapter 4, the beginning of chapter 5, chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 25, chapter 36, and 49, and so on. We're going to be looking at this word called genealogies. Now, when I begin to think of why do we even have this in the Bible, I mean, have you ever read the names and asked why? Why is that in here? Random things like Moses throws down his staff and it turns into a snake and he runs. I think that's the biblical mandate for what you do when you see snakes. But then I ask another question, why is that in there? Things like genealogies is one of those things that people tend to find boring. It's almost like the book of Leviticus. If you just love to listen to legality, legislation, and rules, and all these other things dealing with the law, maybe Leviticus is your book. But last time I checked, nobody ever said Leviticus is their favorite book. So when I look at the word genealogy, and I look at these long lists, even Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, why is it in here? Well, we're going to talk about that from an Old Testament and a New Testament perspective. When I look through the book of Genesis, we talked about this in our introduction, there is a Hebrew word that is a literary device that separates the book not really evenly, but it just gives us kind of indications of what we're looking at. It's the Hebrew word Toledoth. It could be that of descendants, or it could be genealogies. It could be here are the families of, or here is the ancestral narrative of, and it'll give a name right there. And we talked about that in the introduction. But in light of the term genealogy, when I look into chapter 10 of Genesis, which I want us to look at that, there is a certain indicator that tells me here's from the biggest group of people I can find all the way down to the smallest. We could kind of think of it like, what is the world population? Then narrow it down from worldwide to continental. What is the North American population, or I guess we could say the population of the United States? And then we start going smaller. What's the population size of Tennessee? And then we go smaller. What's the population size of Hawkins County? What's the population size of Rogersville? What's the population size of your house? From biggest to smallest, I find through Genesis 10, there is a certain division that we find through the text. I want you to notice in chapter 10, verse number 5, and also verse number 10, I'm going to find 5 different distinctions for how people were categorized from the broadest to the smallest. Notice verse number 5, Genesis 10. From these, the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their, now notice this, their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families or genealogies, into their nations. So I'm looking at every family had a distinct place where they belong. Within that place, in a bigger category, are the peoples. And as I expand that out, I've got language, then I got families, then I got nations. When I look in verse 10, it talks about a guy by the name of Nimrod who did a lot of things, but it would say this is the beginning of the kingdom of Nimrod. That same word for kingdom is something else we'll find in chapter 20 where it talks about the kingdom of the Assyrians. Abimelech would say to Abraham, why have you brought possibly this great sin upon my kingdom? So talking about just a group of people. This division doesn't necessarily impact your understanding of the text per se, but what I want you to get out of this is that God has left clues for what we would call like sociology or anthropology, where you do a study of human history over the years. God had a distinct division for people, which goes to show that this isn't something that's brand new to the human mind. God has already revealed it to people ever since the Pentateuch was ever made available to individuals. In fact, if I plug this into Genesis and I start looking at the different types of genealogies that I find through Genesis, there are 8 different genealogy listings through the book of Genesis. Now, Genesis meaning the beginning. It's the beginning of creation. It's the beginning of marriage. It's the beginning of sin coming into the world. It's the beginning of redemption. But also the book of Genesis, we have to consider this, is a book of families. It is the beginning of a national people or a group of people that God is going to say, "You're mine." And I look at that promise in chapter 12 where I see Abraham being told by God, "I'm going to make you a great name, I'm going to give you a land, and you're going to become a great people." That promise reinstated in chapters 15, 17, and 22. Ultimately, at the end of 22, where Isaac is almost sacrificed, and God says, "No, no, no, no." And then he gets his final kind of, discourse on the blessing that's expanded from chapter 12. Because chapter 12 was conditional. The promise in chapter 15 was conditional. The chapter 17, the promise there was conditional. But then when I get to chapter 22, that promise from chapter 12 is fully expanded into, you will have a generation or you will have a family that will just expand further, much further than any other family known on earth. So when I look in the book of Genesis, genealogies are important. In fact, whenever I look into chapter 36, and it gives me the whole breakdown of the family of Esau, what's the big deal about knowing about the history of Esau? Bible quiz, do we know? What's so important about Esau with the rest of the biblical narrative? He had a birthright. That's really going to impact a lot of things, but Romans 9 would tell us, it wasn't about any of the sons choosing to do good or evil. God just chose Jacob. That's the only reason. We'll look at that when we get into that. Anybody read the book of Obadiah? The book of Obadiah is a judgment book. It's God's judgment not on Israel, and it's not on Judah. It's actually on the kingdom of Edom. In fact, you would find out when you read the end of chapter 25, when you look at Jacob confounding Esau in a moment of weakness, and instead of helping and being his brother's keeper, he ends up turning around and taking advantage of his brother's hunger. And it would say that he gave him what was called red stew. Some translations would say that his stew was Edomed color. And that's the other name for Esau. In fact, multiple times you'll read through the narrative of Jacob and Esau. When it mentions Esau, it would say Esau who is Edom. And you'll find that same thing in chapter 36, Esau who is Edom. And it mentions 12 princes of Edom, the 12 dukes of Edom. Do you know what the number 12 has in relation to those things on Jacob's side? 12 tribes. Yeah, we got the 12 tribes of Israel. So when I'm looking at those numbers, there's something important there. In fact, genealogies as well, I begin to look into the beginning of the expansion of Genesis 3:15, where the woman or the serpent was told that the seed of woman would crush the snake's head or the serpent's seed's head, but the snake would just bruise the heel of the seed of woman, indicating Jesus in the ultimate view of that particular prophecy. But it gives me the beginning of the narrative, like when I'm looking at Adam all the way to Noah, and I'm reading chapter 10, and it mentions this guy by the name of Perez or Peleg. Now, I don't read his name again until I start getting into the end of chapter 11. And then I see there's something weird that happens in chapter 38 with Judah and Tamar. And somehow the lineage of Jesus comes out of some kind of family incestual affair because Judah couldn't actually keep his promise to give his son to Tamar. Now, with all that said, here's the point. Genealogies do make an impact when we get into the New Testament. They make a huge impact in the book of Genesis, and we'll discuss that here in a moment. So when I look at the breakdown through Genesis, it is important, but also when I look into why this is so important in the Old Testament, think first century Jewish culture. You have the Septuagint which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures from Genesis all the way to Malachi. Or excuse me, that's not right. Yeah, Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament. Yes? Okay, had a moment. All the Old Testament. If I'm a Jew in the Old Testament, I'm going to be really big on family history. In fact, in the book of Ezra, I would find out some people weren't allowed to be priests because they had lost their family records. And because they lost their family records, they couldn't serve in the original capacity that their family originally could before they went into captivity. Genealogies were important in Jewish culture. When I look at Deuteronomy 32, and I look at the blessings, or at least the Song of Moses, and I look at the blessings that were given to God's people, I want you to notice what God would say to His people, why it's so important to remember where you came from. He would say, remember the days of old, and consider the years of many generations, genealogies. Ask your father, and he will show you. Your elders, and they will tell you. You ever wonder, younger folk, I know there's only, all of us are young, you ever wonder why the old timers always talk about the good old days? Well, it's because they were really good people and really good memories during those times. I mean, there's a reason we have these things called historian buffs, or we have people who really know war history or some kind of political history. God's saying, you're going to ask the people who are leaders over the nation, and they're going to tell you when the Most High divided their land, the inheritance to the nations, when He separated the, get this, sons of Adam. How am I going to figure out where the descendants of Adam, all the way up to Deuteronomy, would come from? Genealogies. That's where I would find that. Where He set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Now, here is the key point. Why does God include all this? For the Lord's portion is His people. Jacob is the place of His inheritance. Why does God give us genealogies? Well, number one, it wants me to understand that there were people in times past that God said, you're mine. And you know, when I think about a certain type of relationship that is found through the Bible, where those words are used, is in this thing called marriage. You're mine. God has an intimate connection with, a strong relationship with these people who God says, out of all the people in the world, I choose you. Now, in a marriage sense, I mean, that's very humbling. That's very flattering. Someone's eye has somehow, I've caught their eye, or maybe they've caught mine, and we're going to be together for the rest of our life. That's the intention. Well, God says, out of all these people in the world, what if God were to say, you people in Rogersville, you're the only city. I'm going to call you my people. The creator of the universe, out of all the people He could choose, and He chooses us. So when I look at the purpose of genealogies, it's to help me understand we're looking at God's heart. God has given me a history of why He chose these people. But also, secondly, I find it's not just to become God's portion, but God gave me genealogies for the intent to learn those who were involved in service and in the priesthood. I want you to consider Exodus chapter 19, verse 5 and 6, where God's people would stand before Mount Sinai, and it would tell us that God would command His people, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a, get this, special treasure. Does that sound like marriage language? If you're mine, you're my greatest possession in life. I'm not talking about you're a slave, but you're the greatest thing that's ever happened. You're mine. You're valuable to me. A special treasure to me above all the people of the earth, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So when I look at the two reasons why in the Old Testament I find that God includes genealogies, Deuteronomy 32 tells me, I'm listing these so you can find out these are a select people over everybody, but also these were people, the only people allowed to serve for my purposes and to be a priesthood. Now, if I connect that kind of language into the New Testament, two key passages. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. This is written to Christians from an apostle who is getting close to the end of his days. He will write one more text. But notice what he says about the you as Christians. But I want you to imagine he is writing this to you, child of God. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. All three of those. You are a chosen genealogy. Out of all of the history of the world, there is no other people like these people. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, meaning you can serve Him, and a holy nation, meaning you are sanctified. You are His own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Now get this. Why does God include genealogies? Because you, me, were once a people, or once not a people, but now are the people of God. You were one of those people God did not choose. But now He's allowed you where God says, I choose you. From an individual perspective, I don't get that. I don't have to understand God's heart entirely. What the Bible does tell me is God says here, I'm going to put a problem in your mind. I choose you. I choose you, child of God. Now, He chose us to become people of God who had not obtained, here's the key word, mercy, but now have obtained mercy. You know, the only place where I find mercy being found in the New Testament is in two places. Really one, but there's a subcategory in that first place. Number one, the New Testament tells me genealogies are ultimately going to lead to Jesus and His people. So when I look at the purpose in the Old Testament, this is the Lord's portion. This is people who are going to serve God. These are the people who are going to become the royal priesthood, a peculiar treasure, a holy nation. New Testament, those who have committed to Jesus, submitted to Jesus, and even giving praise to Jesus, those are the people in the New Testament. God says, this is why history is important. His story is important. In fact, a verse to consider along with 1 Peter 2, and then we'll go to our New Testament examination. Ephesians 2, 11 through 13. I need to keep this in mind when I decide I want to sin against God. Therefore, remember. Now, that's not a word God throws around that often, but I think God realizes we're quick to forget. Remember that you, once Gentiles in the flesh, that at that time, back then, when you were serving your fleshly desires, you were without Christ, you were aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenant of promise. I would memorize the ending of verse 12 if you really want to get down to the details. How terrible your life was apart from God. You had no hope. Eternally speaking, you kept brushing off that hopelessness. You kept brushing off that sin issue with some kind of pleasure of life, or trying to make some kind of excuse why you shouldn't follow God and why you shouldn't obey Him and why you shouldn't even read His book. You kept making those excuses. You were once there, but you're not there now. You once were without hope, and you were without God in the world. Could you imagine if all of creation did not have God interact in our life? The world would go crazy. Like we wouldn't even have any kind of guide if God was without any hope or any helping us in the world. That's why we have a Bible, to help guide us, to help give us a firm ground that we can build our faith upon. Now he ends this by saying, but now in Christ. This is to you, Christian. Those who once were afar off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Why do we study genealogies? From an Old Testament perspective, I need to know who God chooses as His people, who He chose as His people. In the New Testament understanding, it's no longer that system, but God still chooses a people, not by blood, but rather those who are spiritually of the bloodline of Jesus. Now, what is that? Let's consider the New Testament perspective as you look at the back of the worksheet. When I look into the New Testament, there are two verses that come to mind. I always have to think of what might be some opposing views with certain studies. There are two verses to keep in mind when you study genealogies if someone really wants to ride the argument, but the Bible tells us that genealogies are useless, they're pointless. That is true under the right lens of interpretation. But you've got to ignore a whole lot of other things and violate the rest of proper biblical interpretation to come to that conclusion. Here are my two verses to consider here. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, in verse number 4, Paul would say, I urged you while I was in Ephesus that you would help individuals or teach individuals not to give heed to fables and endless genealogies which cause disputes rather than godly edifying, which is in faith. Now, when I read that text, on the surface, it says, don't give heed to endless genealogies which cause disputes rather than godly edifying, which is in faith. Within context, verse 3 is going to tell me what's under consideration. Notice he says in verse 3 that while I was in Ephesus, I told you, or while I tarry in Ephesus, that you may teach people not to observe any other keyword doctrine. Now, in the New Testament, what doctrine do we follow? 5-letter word. Jesus, the doctrine of Christ. Verse 3 gives me the key answer. Charge some that they teach no other doctrine. Where do genealogies actually apply when it comes to physical bloodline? That's the Old Testament law. Under the New Testament law, I can't take something from the Old Testament, plug that into the New Testament and say, well, that's just gonna have to fly. And we'll look at a passage here in a moment where someone tried to do that in a different manner in the book of Acts. Second text number 2 to consider before we get our main principles here. Titus chapter 3, verse 9. But avoid foolish disputes, genealogies, contentions, and strivings about the law, for they are unprofitable and useless. Why would I waste my time studying genealogies? Within context, Paul is telling Titus to promote sound doctrine. In fact, notice the key word here, strivings about the law. When I read Paul use that phrase, normally he is always referencing, unless indicated otherwise, the law of Moses. When I go through the book of Romans, I will find that Paul will coin the term the law to be a synecdoche, or a term that means the law of Moses, and then he talks about by faith, which is a synecdoche, a term that represents the law of Christ. So if I read this and replace law with the law of Moses, avoid foolish disputes, genealogies, contentions, striving about the law of Moses. They serve no purpose. They are useless. You're wasting all your time focusing on this. You're not focusing on the principles of Christ and being built up to them. So what's my point in this? When I look in Acts 15, I will find at the Jerusalem Council there were some Christians who were Jews, and they said, no, we got to keep our Jewish heritage and plug this into Christianity. And any Gentiles who try to obey the gospel, they've got to keep some of those principles of the old law and bring them into the new law. Paul, Barnabas, Peter, and James would say the same thing. The law of Moses has no place in the law of Christ. And the law of Christ was being prepared while the law of Moses was here. In fact, even Peter would say, why are you trying to bind a burden that not even our fathers could bear? You're adding more things to the gospel of Christ, to the doctrine of Christ, that God never gave. So when I look at this, in the immediate context, this is applying to don't go back or try to plug in the old law into the new law. Law systems cannot combine and be binding. Otherwise, according to Galatians 5, 1 through 4, you have been estranged from Christ. So when I look at the legality of this has nothing to do with, well, what if I want to study the genealogies through the Old Testament? What's the point? Did you know that Romans 15:4 and 1 Corinthians 10:11 tells me the things written aforetime were written for our what? Learning. What if I'm looking at the genealogy so I can better learn about the Old Testament, but maybe that might help my understanding of the New Testament? Do you know what the big deal with Galatians 3 is? About verse 16, 17? It talks about from the beginning of the promise given to Abraham, there were 430 years until the giving of the law. Do you know what text in the Old Testament that takes me back to? Genesis 12, all the way to Exodus 19, end of the chapter. There are 430 years as I'm reading my Pentateuch in Genesis and Exodus between all those chapters. That kind of gives me a time frame of how I need to work through the text a little bit. But even if the apostles bring up an Old Testament example to illustrate a New Testament principle, that's what the inspired writers tell me how I am to look at the Old Testament. It is to help enhance my understanding of the New Testament. If James says in Acts 15 that we can't bind two different law systems together, okay, then what's the New Testament implication for even studying Old Testament genealogies at all? There are two things to keep in mind as we look at this idea of genealogies. The first idea when I look into why study genealogies is that it gives evidence of Jesus fulfilling God's prophecy, or a prophecy from God. I think is how the worksheet has it. In this way, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, that is a vital text to remember. David wanted to build God a house because the Ark of the Covenant had been staying in a tent and had been staying in somebody else's house, but there wasn't a house devoted just for God. That bothered David. Does it bother you if the Word of God has nowhere to go in this world? Well, when he tried to build the house, God came to Nathan in a dream and told Nathan, here, I want you to go tell David this. Don't build me a house. Your son will do that. And I'm honored that you want to build me a house. But it's not like the Lord wants a house. So David, here's what I'm going to do for you. This is what David wasn't asking for at all. And even his words at the end of the text would imply humility from this. David, I'm going to make your house an eternal kingdom. Your throne will always exist. And one of your seed is going to reign forever. And David said, I'm not worthy of this gift. God, I just wanted to build you a house. God says, no, David, no. I'm going to establish you a house. And he did. 2 Samuel gives me that beginning prophecy where that promise is made. Deuteronomy 18, verse 18, I find Moses, a friend of God of sorts, one who spoke to God face to face, almost, one text would say, in a symbolic way, also of Abraham in the same sense. I find that Moses would tell the people, God will raise up a prophet from among your own brethren. And when he comes, that's the guy, that's the one who you need to pay attention to. You know, in the New Testament, in the Gospels, it makes mention of who do men say that I am? Some say Isaiah, some say Jeremiah, some say the prophet. In fact, John 7 entertains that question, is this man the Christ? Surely he's the prophet. This man can't be the Christ. Some would say he can't be the Christ. Some would say, why can't this be the Christ? Nobody else does these kind of miracles. Do not even the leaders or the rulers believe that this is the Christ? He has come? And they couldn't because of the hardness of their heart. The leaders, at least, the people had a better understanding of the reality before them, realizing, hey, Deuteronomy 18:18, it's happening. It's happening. But another text to keep in mind as well is Genesis 22, verse 18. Now, in this context, Abraham has offered up Isaac, and God said, stop. I'm going to make you a great name. You're going to be a great people. The blessings given to you will be exceeding. But there's a statement made there that is of interest that God would provide a lamb. Two things as we look closer at Jesus, who is the Lamb, who is the prophet, who is the King. Number one, when I look at the life of Jesus, so I'm looking at the physical individual, the human being, meaning God with us, the Son of God. There are two things to keep in mind. There are two genealogy chapters in the New Testament that give me an indication to the background of Jesus, Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. Now, when I look at the distinctions of these chapters, I will find out, based off key text through the passage, in Matthew 1, 6 and 12, it tells me this has something to do with, I see King David, and now I see the father of Jesus, who is Joseph. This is the physical bloodline of Jesus in the book of Matthew. When I look at the book of Luke, I begin to look at those who were in positions of royalty, those who were established in positions of power. I'm looking at not the physical bloodline of Jesus, that's important, a prophet of your own brethren. He must be a Jew by blood, but he also must be a king. And sometimes royalty isn't always by blood. Sometimes it's just you fall within the family line. Mary's family in Luke 3 was the royal bloodline. No, I think I got that backwards. Matthew is the royal bloodline. Mary is the physical bloodline. That way it doesn't stay out of the family. Now, when I look into Hebrews 7, this comes back up in a different way. One representing physical birth, the other one representing royalty, but also there needs to be a priest who is sent by God. Well, in Hebrews chapter 7, when it builds that connection of Melchizedek and Abraham, and it talks about Jesus is like Melchizedek, he had neither father nor mother, yet he serves as an eternal priest, one who gave his gift once and for all. Jesus is also, when we go from physical bloodline to royalty, he's also the one who intercedes on behalf of the physical born to the one who is the eternal ruler. He is the intercessor. He's the high priest. That's what Hebrews 7 would tell me. Yes? He was a man, so the language in Hebrews 7 is implying we don't have a genealogy of Melchizedek. And I would even run the logic, Lot was said that he would have been given sacrifices for his family. Job also would have given sacrifices for his family. When we look at Jethro or Reuel, the father-in-law of Moses, he wasn't even a Jew. He was a Midianite who would have been one of the extended cousins of Isaac. He was one of those 6 sons by Keturah in chapter 25. That's just figure of speech to say we don't have any written record of who the father and mother of Melchizedek is. The priest line in the Old Testament had to have a record that they could serve. Jesus had a record, but he didn't come from the tribe of Levi as it's commanded, and it would tell us in that text. It said in the commandments that one of the tribe of Judah was never mentioned to be allowed to serve. But in the New Testament, I find the fulfillment of the prophet of God, the King of God, the one who was born of the physical flesh in the line of the Jews. Jesus fits the bill for all of them. No other person in the world ever fits that. So that's a figure of speech that's used in Hebrews 7, not talking about literally, which Genesis does that a lot, as we talked about with Cain and Abel. Where's the command where God specifies to even give sacrifices, or what kind of sacrifices? By implication, Genesis does that a lot. God said a lot of things that we just don't have record of, but the people did it. And according to Hebrews 11, a lot of those things where we don't read the commands, they did it by faith, which tells me God told them. So when I look at number one for the evidence, in the life of Christ, Jesus fits the mold. But then in the line of Christ. Now, what do I mean by lined? Yes, but not physical. When we, well, maybe not here. If you were going to put, what do they call that stuff on the ceiling? Spackle? Is it spackle? No, not the white stuff. Huh? Count on you, man. Don't know. Okay, so when I look at stuff on the ceiling, popcorn? Yes, ceiling popcorn. That's the name. Spackle's the stuff where you fill in cracks and stuff for nails. When I look at the ceiling popcorn, normally when you watch people put that stuff up on the ceiling, they line the walls and all the furniture with all this plastic wrap so the popcorn doesn't get on the furniture and it gets really dusty. For some reason, I think it's just the mixture of stuff. But they do that to protect things. In a spiritual sense, it is what Jesus provides that lines, not the exterior, but what lines the interior. In fact, I'm just going to put all three of these up because we're slowly running out of time. When I look into Galatians chapter 3, it tells me that I must be of the seed line of Abraham. Now, that's going to present a couple of problems. Can anybody here actually trace their family history back to the seed line of Abraham by blood? I mean, if you do belong to that family, wow, you have a family history, man. We don't have that. We can't prove that we physically belong to that. But according to Galatians 3:26 to the end of the chapter, it tells me that if I've been baptized into Christ, if I have put on Christ through baptism, I am now considered the seed of Abraham, which tells me those descendants that that Abraham was promised, in one sense talked about the physical growth of the nation of Israel, but that wasn't the ultimate consideration of that promise. The fullest fulfillment of that promise, I find from Galatians 3, is those who are of the seed line of Christ. That's how the descendants of Abraham are more than the stars in the sky or the sands in the sea. But I find through three texts here, number one, spirit of adoption. Romans chapter 8 talks about that we have been given the Spirit who allows us to cry, Abba, Father. But later in that text, it would tell me that God has revealed His Spirit when the creation from the beginning was groaning and moaning, waiting for the sons of God to appear. And it mentions adoption. Did you know that without God, there is absolutely nowhere in eternity you could go? Nowhere. Now, as far as I'm aware, I don't think we have orphans in here. But I need you to consider, what if you grew up and you had no parents? You had no guardians. You had no one. Spiritually speaking, without God, that's exactly what we would have if He didn't intercede on our behalf. God has given us the spirit of adoption. The second point is not in Romans 9, it's in Romans chapter 11, but the verses are right, where it uses this illustration of an olive tree where we were Gentiles in times past, and God has grafted the Gentiles in to be saved under the law of Christ. Now, he also throws the argument in, what if those Jews who rejected Jesus, what if some of them decided to eventually come around? They started realizing, oh man, this law is obsolete. We do need to obey Jesus. God would say, don't even despise the Jewish nation of those who rebuked Jesus and crucified Jesus. Forgiveness is for them too. God has grafted us into what is called the olive tree, Paul would say. And then a verse that we read a little bit earlier, Ephesians chapter 2, we were once strangers, but now we are citizens. All of us, I believe, have been born in the United States, but not a single one of us, when we were born in heaven. Even through the age of innocence, we still were not born into heaven. Now, if we were to die in that state, we would be, because there's no sin upon us, Romans 7. But did you know, until you obeyed the gospel, you had no eternal home? You did not belong in heaven. No one belongs in heaven. That's the whole purpose of being lined by Jesus. Now, in the final moments, did you know in Isaiah chapter 53, as we conclude all these thoughts, what's the point you're trying to make, Ethan? When I look into why study genealogies, I need to take into consideration the eternal genealogy. Did you know that in Isaiah 53, we normally talk about verse 7, he was like a sheep led to the slaughter and he opened not his mouth. When you read verse 8, look at the language here. He was taken from prison and from judgment. who will declare his generation? Who will declare his genealogy? Did Jesus have a wife? Did he have kids? You know, later through this text, it would say he will see his seed. His seed. He didn't have kids. He didn't have kids. Group of people came to Jesus preaching in a house, chock full. His mother and his brother come desiring to seek him. Can you ring the bell? Desiring to seek him. And the question's asked, hey, they desire to seek you. And Jesus would make the response where we began. Who is my mother and my brother? And he looked around in a circle at those who sat about him. And he said, whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and mother. Did you know that Jesus can continue through you? Will you be the one to declare that Jesus is open for adoption? He's looking to adopt people. And if you're not his, then maybe you can begin declaring the greatest genealogy of all, how Jesus came and died for your sins and for your soul, so you could have a home, not here, though there is a family here on earth, but an eternal home. I can't get the address for that unless I sign the adoption papers. And he's already signed it. He's just waiting for you. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to go on a flood. Someone says it's going to be sunny the next 7 days. Well, next Wednesday it won't be. Now, if it literally is raining, that's not prophecy. But we're going to look at the story of Noah and his family in Genesis 6. So I appreciate your time and attention. We'll be back here in just a few moments.